Hi guys, it's our AP Period 4 review for our test this Friday. So the years for Period 4 are 1800 to 1848. 1800 represents the election of Thomas Jefferson, that revolution of 1800, that transition of power from the Federalists to the Democratic Republicans. And then 1848 is the Seneca Falls Convention, when the women's rights movement unofficially begins. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott. It's also the year if the Mexican War ends, but what we're going to be doing is we're going to be picking up period 5 with the Mexican War and seeing how that leads into the Civil War. So let's start off by talking about the market revolution. So the American economy between 1800 and 1848 vastly expands. In the United States, territory is expanding, but so is our market reach across the world and the wealth of the United States. The market revolution is encompasses a lot of different variables, things like transportation, the growth of the canals. The Erie Canal set off the canal boom in 1825. You have the steamboat, which is able to travel against the current and provide much more reliable methods of shipping. So with the canals, you have access to from the Great Lakes region all the way to New York City. So farmers who are living in the interior, places like Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, are able to sell their crops, across the United States and have a much broader market, which gives them, obviously a lot more money in their pockets. And it gives these states growing numbers and more political representation. Because of this market revolution and because of transportation networks, our country becomes much more regionalized as far as the economy goes. The North is more manufacturing, some farming. In the South, you have the plantation economy, the slavery economy premised on cotton and rice and tobacco and sugar. Of those, cotton is by far the number one export. By the end of this time period, 2/3 of American exports are cotton. That's the entirety of the United States. And then the West is also farming, meat, things of that nature. But all these different regions of the country are now linked because of transportation, hence the market revolution. Politically speaking, we start off with the election of 1800. Democratic Republicans come to power under Thomas Jefferson. The irony here is that the Democratic Republicans stand for smaller government, but Thomas Jefferson is going to greatly expand the power of the federal government with things like the Louisiana Purchase and the Embargo Act. And his successors, James Madison, James Monroe, also of the same party, are going to do likewise. James Monroe, the War of 1812. I'm sorry, James Madison, the War of 1812. There is going to be a rift as far as politics go. The Federalist Party is going to disintegrate during this time period. The Hartford Convention in 1814, during the War of 1812. There was a group of Federalists that wanted to secede from the Union, which was too much for many of the Federalists. And so, long story short, the party does disband. In 1824, the Democratic Republicans disband. You have some who join the National Republican Party. So you have John Quincy Adams versus Andrew Jackson versus William Crawford versus Henry Clay. It's that famous four-way race where Andrew Jackson wins a majority of the votes. I'm sorry, he wins more votes. He wins more electoral college votes, but he does not win a majority of either. Henry Clay throws his support behind John Quincy Adams, hence that corrupt bargain where Henry Clay gives Adams his votes in exchange for the Secretary of State. Whether or not there's actually a corrupt bargain or not is not for us to discern at this moment, but what we know comes out of that is Andrew Jackson fuming mad. By 1828, you have the beginning of the second party system. And Jackson is a Democrat. He is, he wins the election pretty easily against John Quincy Adams. By 1832, he has a Whig opponent. So you have the Democrats and the Whigs in the second party system. But Andrew Jackson politically is going to move the country in a different direction, centralizing power in the federal government, flexing his muscles with things like the Indian Removal Act, which leads to 8 years later the Trail of Tears, disintegrating the Second National Bank, refusing to recertify its charter in 1832 prior to the election. He's also going to, threaten with the force bill to use the military to suppress any nullification movement in South Carolina. If they threaten to secede, he will send the military down there. So the second party system, now you have two competing parties, but it's not so much power of the federal government now as what's the role of the federal government, where are they going to spend their money. The American system was Henry Clay's baby that was adopted by the American system was adopted by the Whig Party. Jackson did not believe the federal government should be used to pay for an excessive amount of internal improvements, whereas the American system under the Whigs with Henry Clay said they're going to use tariffs to pay for internal improvements, things like canals, roads, bridges to link uh, north and south, but specifically north and west. And again, tariffs when it comes to the South is the thing that they hate the most as far as the economy goes, because their economy is premised on plantation life. And if you have high tariffs, you're taking you're adding money to the price that the average Southerner pays for their goods. So tariffs, politically speaking, are always like playing with fire. Economically speaking, the South feels that it's going to crush their economy to have these high tariffs. So you have this division, North versus South, based on tariffs. But again, the biggest division, North versus South, is obviously slavery. In the 1790s, the cotton gin was invented by Eli Whitney. And what this ends up doing is it ends up making cotton much more easy to not only pick, but to get the seeds out. And you can basically sell as much cotton as you can grow, because the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain has taken off. In America, it's here. Factories are demanding cotton as much as can be picked. So this actually intensifies the need for slave labor. In 1808, the international slave trade, as far as the United States goes, is over. In the Constitution, international slave trade from Africa ends in 1808. Not there wasn't still smuggling that was going on, but if you're a law-abiding Southerner, you have to now find a new source of slaves. So the internal slave trade starts to boom. Places like Virginia, Maryland, don't have the need for slaves that they once did as far as the numbers go. So they're starting to sell their slaves south and westward. Because during the early part of the 1800s, we talked about the fighting that Andrew Jackson had done against the Native Americans in places like what is now Alabama, Mississippi. So this area now is open for westward expansion from plantation owners. The Louisiana Territory, purchased in 1803 by Thomas Jefferson, the example of the Democratic Republicans actually expanding federal power, opens up, obviously what is now Louisiana, all the way up the Mississippi River. This is going to be land that's going to be heavily disputed. So when it comes to slavery goes hand in hand with westward expansion at this time, because the big question every time there is a new state that comes into the Union is, are they going to allow slavery or are they not going to allow slavery? And there was a balance of power between slave states and free states that was maintained throughout this time period, but not without controversy. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise brought Missouri in as a slave state, but brought Maine in as a free state. When it came to the Missouri Compromise, everything north of the 3630 parallel, except for Missouri within the Louisiana Territory, was to remain free, whereas everything south of that was to be slave. So again, as long as there's territory westward to expand to, the slavery question dividing north and south could be kicked down the road for future administrations to figure out. In 1831, Nat Turner's rebellion really freaked a lot of Southerners out, because Nat Turner was a seemingly docile slave, somebody who was easy to deal with and was reliable to his owners. And next thing you know, you have upwards of 57 white people who were killed with the slave uprising. It was suppressed. Nat Turner and a few dozen of his supporters were hanged as an example. But what this does in the South is it really starts to get Southern legislatures thinking about tightening slavery's rules, making it more difficult to manumit or to free slaves, making it forbidden to teach them to read and write, things of that nature. Then in 1836, you have the battle for Texas independence. In 1836, when Texas wins its independence, Southerners are salivating because they see this huge, massive, hot state that we're able to grow cotton as being a great way to expand slavery. The northern states are not in favor of annexing Texas because they don't want to expand into a state that's going to have slavery, throw the balance of power off. So for 9 years, Texas is an independent state. It's not until 1845 that it actually comes into the Union. We'll focus more on Texas in the next period, but just for the understanding of this particular time period, when it came to slavery, Texas was a huge issue that divided North and South. We talk about the economy and how during this time period the economy is booming. There are also busts. There's the Panic of 1819, the Panic of 1837. And if you remember, panic is another word for depression at this time period. The Panic of 1837 was the big one. It was an economic depression that lasted into the early 1840s, and it really got a lot of Americans thinking about not only the role of the federal government, but the role of social movements in the United States and what the individuals in this country could do to morally perfect Americans, what we could do to avert disasters like this from happening again. Another thing that goes hand in hand with economic catastrophe, as far as the moralists would have seen at this time, or the growth of cities. You have cities that are known as dens of vice. Alcohol, prostitution, gambling, things of that nature. So with cities, you also have a rise in immigration. You have people coming over from this time period, specifically from Germany and Ireland. A lot of people from Ireland are also Catholics, so they bring their Catholic ways with them. They drink. They bring a culture that where drinking is more common in Germany and Ireland. And a lot of nativists in the United States do not like these trends. They do not like the growth of Catholicism. They see alcohol is going hand in hand with Catholicism and debauchery and things of that nature. So this segues perfectly into the last part of our unit, which was the social movements of this time period. The Second Great Awakening was a religious movement, a Protestant Christian movement, 1820s, 1830s, that really sparks or galvanizes a lot of people into either readopting Christianity or really becoming more fiery in their beliefs and believing that although you get salvation in heaven, you can do more on your own to make this world more morally perfect. So a couple movements that come out of the Second Great Awakening: you have the temperance movement, you have abolition, you have the women's rights movement, you have utopian societies. There's all kinds of different ways that you can look at it. We'll focus on temperance first. Temperance, you have people who are like women who are joined the temperance movement very early on. You have religious leaders. You have nativists, people who are anti-immigrant, that see temperance with going along against being against what the Irish and the Germans are bringing here. But the belief that alcohol leads to a lot of sin, a lot of domestic abuse, and the movement itself does not really have the success that it's hoping to. A lot of these social movements that we see here in the early 1800s, mid 1800s, don't actually become law or change society legally until the early 1900s. You have the abolition movement. 1831, William Lloyd Garrison forms the Liberator newspaper. And what was so radical about abolition? A lot of Northerners didn't like slavery, but they didn't think to get rid of it because so much of our economy was premised on slavery, the cotton, again, being 2/3 of the economy. So many of the northern manufacturers that relied on cotton, imports from the South to turn into textiles, or the northern shipping magnates who took southern cotton to Europe. So it wasn't a matter of getting rid of it for many Northerners. They may have opposed it morally, but they may not have opposed it in general. Whereas abolitionists believed in getting rid of slavery for moral reasons and also not compensating the southern slave owners, which was pretty revolutionary at the time, because when you take somebody's property without compensating them for it, there are people that think that goes against the Constitution. There were utopian movements. Oh, sorry, going back to the abolition movement. So William Lloyd Garrison's leader, the Liberator, but Frederick Douglass is a former slave who is, for many, the eloquent mouthpiece, somebody who had been a slave himself, that was out preaching against it. He was one of the most famous speakers of his time period. Within the abolition movement, you have women who are trying to get involved, but the women a lot of times are treated like second-class citizens within the movement. Out of this abolition movement comes the women's rights movement. The idea here: we won't be able to get much done politically until we ourselves have more political rights. So in 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott lead the Seneca Falls Convention, which takes place in Seneca Falls, New York. The Declaration of Sentiments is declared. Women are pushing now for suffrage, for equal rights, divorce rights, things of that nature. Again, women will not get the right to vote until 1920. Women were not fighting for suffrage rights throughout period 4, but by the end of period 4, that question was being brought up, and there were some women questioning traditional gender roles. That call of domesticity was not as fulfilling for some women as it was for others. Lastly, we'll talk about the utopian movements. The Romantic period in in European history spills over into America, and this whole idea of being able to morally perfect people here in the United States. The movement with transcendentalism, Ralph Waldo Emerson. So some of the utopian movements, such as the Mormons, who would eventually settle in Salt Lake City and the Utah Territory, believed in human perfection. The Oneida, the Shakers, the Harmonites. But there was also in our country this time this growing desire to have some kind of a national culture. And some of these utopian movements actually kind of meshed with these artists and poets and writers who were trying to forge a national voice for our country. Again, a lot of information here in period 4, 1800 to 1848. Any questions, please feel free to see me.